On paper, Death Stranding definitely seems like a contender for my favorite game of all time. It's more thought-provoking than anything I've played in a long time. The gameplay loop is unique and addictive. It's full of great Kojima-isms that longtime fans will enjoy. The soundtrack is fantastic, the performances are great, the story is emotional, the graphics are easy on the eyes. If I was handing out review scores, Death Stranding would get a 10 out of 10 from me, no question. But it's not my favorite game of all time. It's not even in the conversation, really. In my eyes, nothing will ever beat The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, or Uncharted 2, or Fallout New Vegas. But it got me thinking, if not Death Stranding, then what? What would it take for a new game to become my favorite game of all time, or even in my top 5? What would a game have to do in order for me to even consider comparing it to Wind Waker? So I'm going into hypothetical territory here. I'm gonna look at what I like in video games and the kinds of genres or creators it would take to make something to usurp Wind Waker as my favorite game of all time. Is it even possible? And no, I'm not gonna take the easy joke route answer and say a Wind Waker remake with less sailing and no Triforce Quest, because, and I don't really know how else to say this, I actually like the Triforce Quest. To find this hypothetical and elusive game, I'm going to form it around key parts of game design. I'll need a genre, a studio, a setting, and a style. I'm going to use those 4 conditions to see if I can even think of a game that could beat Wind Waker. Let's assume this has an infinite budget, all the time in the world to make, no corporate interference, no buts of any kind. This is a dream game. Okay, with all that taken into consideration, let's dive in. Here's what a game would have to do in order to become my new favorite. Genre. When I look at my top 10 games lists, or even my top 20, there's a ton of diversity in regards to genre. I've got JRPGs, action games, Western RPGs, first-person shooters, adventure games, racing games. It's kind of hard to pin down a specific game genre I like more than the others. You could look at it logistically and track each and every game I put on my top 100 list, categorize them by genre, add them all up, and whichever shows up the most, that's the winner. I could do that, and I did do that. Here's what I found. And keep in mind, this doesn't include any 2019 games. And in the spirit of analyzing a top 100 list, I'm going to present the results in a countdown format. Coming in at number 5 on the list is the racing genre, taking up a total of 8 spots on the list. Next, at number 4 are third-person shooters with a close 9 entries. At number 3, we have action games with the lucky 13. Second is open world games with 14, and at number 1, there are 21 first-person shooters. So I guess our game has to be an FPS, right? No. This raw mathematical approach doesn't take into account that the games at the top of the list kind of matter more. They're at the top after all. So despite first-person shooters taking up most of the list, there's only 1 in the top 10. So does that mean they count less and third-person shooters count more because there's 3 of them in the top 10? Can you even count all 3 of them as traditional third-person shooters? Some of the games could count as multiple genres. What about those? This isn't something that's quantifiable by logic or math. So I'm gonna go with the thing that's gotten me this far in life, my feelings. These days, genres are so intertwined and experimental, it's hard to stick a fork in it and really settle on something so general yet so specific. I think it's gotta be in the third person. I look at my favorite franchises in gaming like Zelda, Uncharted, and Metal Gear Solid. Those are all third-person games, but they're not all directly comparable. I love the melee combat of games like God of War, the mobility of something like Spider-Man, but I also like shooting stuff from time to time. Despite my affinity toward third-person action-adventure games, I do love a good FPS. However, I think I'd be able to sacrifice that perspective for an exercise in visceral combat and a fast-paced movement system. There needs to be exploration, but I don't want to feel like I'm missing anything, and I don't want to have to backtrack much, if at all. I'm thinking it's gotta be an open-world game, but not something too overwhelmingly huge. Everyone lauded The Witcher 3 for its seemingly never-ending amount of content, but that's what kind of turned me off about it. I want something that respects my time, but if this is my favorite game we're talking about, I may not want it to end. I certainly felt that way about Death Stranding, and I still feel that way about Wind Waker and New Vegas. I remember playing Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and that being where I drew the line. Imagine if the city of Athens was the entire game, and the attention that went into making the map as comically large as it is instead went into a densely populated and incredibly detailed city. I'd rather have a smallish open world that's dense with things to do instead of a wide open area with the same amount of things to do. If a game has an auto-traversal option, it's doing something wrong. Traversal should be fun. Fast travel should be an option, but not something you're compelled to do that often or something you rely on. It needs a strong emphasis on storytelling too. The kinds of stories I love are the kind that get a bit existential. They ask questions about the human experience and our relationships with one another. I thought Death Stranding was fantastic in this regard. The whole game basically asks, do humans even have a right to exist? If we're going to die, why not just get it over with? What's holding us back? This kind of thought-provoking narrative has to be involved. You know you've experienced true art when it changes your perception on life a little bit, and that's what my theoretical next favorite game will have to do. So basically, it has to be a third-person, narrative-focused, open world game that's long, but not too long. Dense, but not overwhelming. I actually don't want it to be too decision-based because that kind of stresses me out with the threat of a bad ending. It needs some kind of linearity, but the open-endedness to get to the story when I want to get to it. The game needs great traversal and movement, but also needs some visceral melee and gun combat. I like some RPG elements too, but not too much. A skill tree is good enough for me. Okay, so we have a genre, narrative-focused, third-person open-world action game. But the questions only get tougher from here. Who should make it? The studio. In order to figure out what studio and which director should take a stab at it, I'm going to have a look at things based on where the games I love are from. Again, I went back to the top 100 well and identified each and every country responsible for each and every game on the list. Basically, it came down to the United States and Japan, with my home country having 43 and Japan taking 32. Each country was pretty evenly distributed throughout the list, but my top 10 definitely has more Japan than America. Again, I'm going to have to go with my instincts on this one. At this point, if we're going by math only, it would be an American FPS, which, I mean, I'm not opposed to. In this case though, the mathematical approach is actually correct, to an extent. There's one studio that shows up twice in my top 10, and it's the one I'm going to go with, Naughty Dog. Naughty Dog is a studio I unequivocally trust. I never doubt them. Even with the disastrous development process of Uncharted 4 and a smaller team within the studio releasing a great Uncharted game in The Lost Legacy, they're an absolute force to be reckoned with. And if you're unaware, please read Blood, Sweat, and Pixels by Jason Schreier. It details the entire development process of Uncharted 4, and it's kind of a miracle that game even got made, let alone was as good as it was. I'm also a huge fan of Neil Druckmann. I feel like he's one of the most talented narrative directors in the industry, with a real penchant for impactful stories that actually have some subtlety and nuance to them. Video games often have the narrative subtlety of a sledgehammer with a flamethrower attached, so Neil's more subdued approach, especially noticeable in the ending of The Last of Us, is a very welcome necessity in this growing medium. However, Neil's a narrative director, and while I'm sure he's perfectly capable in a game director position, I'd like to partner him with someone the same way he partnered with Bruce Straley on Uncharted 2, The Last of Us, and Uncharted 4. Here's where some dream team stuff comes in. I want to see Neil co-direct with none other than Hideo Kojima. Now, I know what you're thinking, but wait, aren't those just two narrative directors? And yeah, you're kinda right. But I think Kojima is insanely underrated as a game director. Take one look at Metal Gear Solid 5's incredible gameplay loop, and Death Stranding's unique approach to, well, everything. Kojima isn't just a fantastic storyteller, he's a game maker too. And him collaborating with Neil Druckmann would be an absolute sight to behold. Assume there's no language barrier, no creative differences or anything like that, and something special would be bound to happen. But the realistic answer would simply be Naughty Dog. But my dream answer is Naughty Dog plus Kojima. To keep things simple, however, I'm just gonna go with Naughty Dog. If they could make something unique akin to Kojima Productions with Death Stranding, we'd be in for some serious business. God, I love Death Stranding. We have our genre, we have our studio, but where should the game take place? Setting. Using my list once again, I separated each game into different categories. These categories might seem a bit odd at first, but I'll explain the more interpretive ones. There's the modern or realistic category, for games that take place in our reality or a very similar version of reality. I included superhero games in this, since they mostly take place in a version of a reality rather than a completely alternate reality where everything is completely different, because I have a category for that. Then I have historical, which is purely for games that take place in the past. World War II games, stuff like Assassin's Creed. It might have some alt history stuff here and there, but it's not alt history the same way games like Wolfenstein or Bioshock are. I also have an alt history category for that. I have science fiction, post-apocalyptic, fantasy, and something I call alt fantasy. These are games that have elements of our reality, but are ultimately completely different universes. Pokemon, Mario, Crash Bandicoot, they aren't fantasy per se, but they aren't modern or realistic either. There might be some smartphones, cars, whatever, but Pokemon exist, or humans don't exist at all. With all that said, the leading contenders here are historical with 14, alt fantasy with 21, and modern or realistic at 33. To be honest, I'm not always in the mood for science fiction, and even though historical takes third place, it wouldn't be my first choice. Or my second or third for that matter. I think the idea of alt fantasy has the most malleability. You could pretty much do anything you want. Modern or realistic settings might make up most of the list, but I think for the game I want, total creative freedom, unbeholden by typical conventions, would be the best choice. This needs to be a paradigm-shifting work of art, and you can't do that by adhering to a familiar reality. I know I keep bringing up Death Stranding, but that's the game that inspired this whole conversation anyway. Death Stranding has its own creative language, facilitated by presenting a world like no one has ever seen before. It's familiar, but completely radical. It's America, but filled with BTs, chiral networks, cupids, bridge babies. You could call it science fiction, alt fantasy, post-apocalyptic, but regardless of which category it belongs to, the fact remains that it's pretty groundbreaking in comparison to anything that's come before. This hypothetical game needs that same kind of freedom. So what we have now is an alt fantasy, narrative-focused, third-person open-world action game made by Naughty Dog. Kinda sounds like Jak and Daxter now that I think about it. But my alt fantasy is intended more as Final Fantasy 15 alt fantasy than Ratchet & Clank alt fantasy. A fantasy based on reality, as Square Enix put it. This hypothetical game is almost ready for pre-production, but what will it look like? Like, really look like? Style. Video games have always been Herculean efforts to push technological boundaries and advance the medium with stunning visuals like particle effects, volumetric god rays, 4K textures, fluid animation, but none of those are necessary to make something unforgettable. Some of the most visually impactful games of the past 2 decades have been games like Hotline Miami, Persona 5, Transistor, Borderlands, Broken Age, games that focus on utilizing pixel art, anime aesthetics, or hand-drawn visuals. And I know I'm partial to it, but Wind Waker is included too, with its infamous cel-shaded style. Empirical evidence would suggest that my favorite games focus on realistic visuals, with 65 out of 100 games on my list having some kind of realistic quality to them. But when a game has a stylized aesthetic and nails it, there's nothing else like it. Persona 5 is one of the best examples of inspired, non-realistic art direction you can find in a game. The menus pop, the colors are vibrant. I'd be hard-pressed to find a more stylish game out there. It's the perfect execution of concept. Obviously, it comes with the subtext of being an anime game, but that's not the reason it sticks out. It definitely helps though. It may seem like I'm coming out in favor of a stylized art style, but I'm actually going to go with a realistic art style. Realistic-ish. This isn't the first time I've brought it up, but I'm actually looking at Final Fantasy 15 for inspiration for this. It's somewhere in between the two. It's realistic, but it's also stylized at the same time. I don't really know how to describe it, to be honest. It's the kind of realistic that makes it easy to admire how rich and detailed the world is, but stylized to the point where it can stand up to the test of time. The character models still have a kind of anime quality to them, and the entire world has a kind of sun-washed vibe. Everything's so vibrant and colorful. It's what I imagine Wind Waker would look like if it was remade in 2019 without its trademark cel shading. I want something that can show off the visual fidelity of the hardware it's on, but also something that can stand the test of time. Jury's still out on where Final Fantasy 15 will end up, but it's pretty easy to see the game is easy on the eyes. Now all the pieces are in play. We have everything we need: genre, studio, setting, and style. All that's left is to put them all together and iron out the details. The game. If we were to go by the numbers and use math to pinpoint a game that would top my top 100 list, it would be an American-made, realistic FPS set in modern times, but I mean, Modern Warfare is right there, and that's not my favorite game of all time. What we actually have is an open-world, third-person action game with an emphasis on story. It has both melee and ranged combat, guns, a skill tree, and it's dense, but not too dense. The story would take around 25 to 35 hours to finish, and around 50 hours to 100%. It takes place in an alternate universe where things are pretty different, but it's ultimately a story about the human condition. It has fantasy elements, but it's a contemporary or near-future tale. This game has a semi-realistic art style, but interprets certain elements like characters and the fauna in a more stylized way. I'm thinking it takes place in a city, because this game has to have fast and fluid traversal. Grappling hooks, maybe a jet booster, kind of like Boba Fett would have had in the cancelled Star Wars 1313. I want something that moves like Spider-Man, but packs a wallop like Kratos in God of War. There's killing and gore. This game is going to have an M rating. It's a mature game in both plot and content. This isn't a sequel or an iteration. It's something that stands on its own, the same way Death Stranding does. It might be an open world game, but it won't be a traditional one. No towers to climb, no mini-map, no driving, no endless collectibles. Everything needs to have purpose. I think it's fine to have things to go and collect, but they need to be relevant to the main character or add to the overall narrative, like the backpacks in Spider-Man. What if we had some Monster Hunter elements in this too? You hunt monsters in the city, harvest their parts, upgrade your character, and help out the people. Dragons running loose in a neon city at night, their fiery breath lighting up the starless horizon. In my head, I see it like the creatures of Skyrim mixed with Night City from Cyberpunk 2077. It needs some human enemies too, though. In the simplest of terms, we have Spider-Man mixed with God of War, mixed with Monster Hunter, mixed with Max Payne, mixed with Uncharted. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like a game I'd play. Zipping around, mounting a dragon, jumping off, shooting a guy in the face in slow motion, all while contemplating the mysteries of human existence. On paper, this sounds like the most me game I can possibly imagine. It's got everything I like in a game. Action, intrigue, traversal, story. But could it beat Wind Waker? That's the key point in all of this, though. On paper. The verdict. The thing is, on paper is never going to be enough. On paper, Death Stranding doesn't seem like it would be very fun at all, but it's one of my favorite games of all time now. I was blown away at how unique the whole thing is, how the entire thing is about human connection on both a narrative and gameplay level. It's a work of art, it's genius. It should be in contention with Wind Waker as my favorite game of all time, but it's not. I always told myself that when something comes along and shifts my perspective of the medium, my perspective of what video games can be and how they can affect me, that's when I'll consider something for contention as my favorite game of all time. And it happened, but all I can think about are the buts, and not Norman Reedus's. I love this, but I think this was great, but I just don't have the necessary kind of childlike ignorance to not only look past a game's flaws, but to accept them and love them. No, I don't think anything will ever top Wind Waker for me. In fact, I don't think anything will ever even be in the same conversation. I just presented the most me game I could possibly conceive, and I still don't think it could come close. Maybe if I helped make the damn thing, I'd think about it, considering that would be a game that would be a crucial part of my life's journey. It's possible to form new tastes and to develop new favorites, but I think once you reach a certain age, it's nearly impossible to replace that #1 spot. With age comes cynicism, and time hones taste. When you're young, you're still developing the tastes that will influence the rest of your life. The games you play, the movies you watch, the music you listen to, your identity itself. Your favorite game is the uncompromisable, the game you don't have anything bad to say about. It's the game that comes from a different time in your life, a game when you were not only willing to overlook your issues with games, you didn't even notice the issues to begin with. Everyone remembers where they were when they played their favorite game for the first time, how it made them feel, how it changed their perspective, how it blew their mind. You might have been playing games for months, years, even decades, then boom, out of nowhere, nothing is the same. You feel it the second you play it, even if you don't realize it right away. There's just something different about this one. There was your life before this game, and now there's your life after. It doesn't matter if on paper something is perfect for you. Your favorite game is something you didn't even realize you needed until you played it. So how can a game created from your mind possibly come close to one that completely blindsided you? Death Stranding has obviously had a profound effect on me. Maybe I should consider it, but I just can't bring myself to. The fact is, I have something to confess. Maybe it's the antidepressants I'm taking, maybe it's a quarter-life crisis, I don't know. But I want to make video games. I want to be a writer. I want to be a director. I have ideas, and I want to work with programmers and artists and level designers to make those ideas a reality. Just the thought of it makes my heart race, and it gets me out of bed in the morning. Actually, I can hardly sleep just thinking about it. Martin Scorsese said in an advertisement for a course he taught for a website called Masterclass, if you're intrigued by movie making as a career, this isn't the class for you. But if you need to make movies, if you feel like you can't rest until you've told this particular story that you've been burning to tell, then I could be speaking to you. That touched me on a really personal level, and it really made me rethink why I do what I do. I didn't want to get involved with game development until it came from a real, genuine place from within my heart, and I finally feel that. I finally have that story that I need to tell, an experience that I have to share with other people, multiple in fact. And then maybe, just maybe, I'll finally find the game that means enough to me to be my next favorite game of all time. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, feel free to subscribe to the channel, share it around, or support me on Patreon. And hey, if you're involved with game development, get in touch. I'd love to hear about what you're working on, or if there's anything I can do to help make your game, or if there's anything you can do to help me make my games. My email address will be in the description, or just shoot me a DM on Twitter. Just stay on topic. And don't worry, I don't plan on quitting this overnight. I'm glad you watched, and I'll see you next time.